The Ottoman Empire. This is one of the empires that will resist industrialization for quite some time. Let's see if I can get this to work for you. So, like China, they were super successful and they felt they had nothing to learn from anyone else. It's the way China has kind of, when we've talked about them, like they had everything they needed, they didn't need anyone else. They had the best of everything, so why would they ever ask anyone else for help? Because everyone else is kind of beneath them. The Ottoman Empire feels very, very similar to that. Um, they were close with Europe, like geographically, and to some extent worked with them, but also we're still kind of like this separate civilization. Um, China and the Ottomans never fall under anyone's direct control, but they're diminished. Their global power, they were once these great, amazing states, and then they start shrinking in their awesomeness and their power. Um, Both kind of have this goal of I just want to preserve my independence. I want to be in control of myself. And the only reason they start modernizing is to defend themselves. It's not because they want to push forward. It's, oh my God, everyone is ahead of us, and now we're being threatened by those who are more progressed than us. So we need to do all we can to do this modernization to defend ourselves, which a lot of it is going to be military. How do we build a military and weaponry that is able to fight everything else that's going on in Western Europe? So both China and the Ottomans are just really tied to their old traditional ways and values. And it would be a very large cultural shift for them to change all of these things. So by this time in history, people start calling them the sick man of Europe. They're just kind of like this old man that everyone is waiting to die. They're just like running out of steam. And so a lot of this is due to overexpansion of the empire. They just got too big. Um, they're not modernizing, which is a complete failure for them. They're struggling with ethnic nationalism and kind of just like polarizing identities existing and infighting. And then you have a lot of government corruption. When they become weak, they are easy pickings for Napoleon with France, the Russians, the British. Everyone wants a piece of the Ottoman Empire. And since they are so weak, it's kind of easy to pick off what you want. So here we have the Ottoman Empire with his arms crossed, looking rather angry, as royalty from other nations start ripping it apart and taking what they want. So this is the empire at its peak. So they start adding people over time. But if you look at the dark red, this is where they end up by 1914, close to when World War I starts. It shrinks drastically. So when we look at why, there is a steep political decline. The Janissaries, which were their elite fighting force, they start plotting military coups because the leadership is bad. We have massive corruption going on throughout the empire. That's politically. Economically, it's cheaper to import goods. So people who produce like local stuff, no one wants to buy those because it's cheaper to get them from other places, which means you're sending money out of your country and you're not fueling the economy within your borders. You also start seeing an increase on foreign loans because their economy is just in rough shape. And then you have something called capitulations, where there's an exemption of Europeans to Ottoman law. This idea that if you're a European, you can, I guess, get away with more would be the easiest way to put it. So the Ottomans are just kind of, I don't know, bending over backwards for the Europeans because they owe the Europeans money and all of that. So when we talk about these territorial losses again, it's Russia, Britain, France, Austria, all of them are just snatching up territory because the Ottomans have become that weak. So you can see the area is just starting to reduce over time eventually. The big one that the book talks about, and that is notable, is in Egypt. So the Ottomans at one point owned Egypt, but then you have Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, different Muhammad Ali. He steps in. He is an Ottoman military officer, and he wins some popularity in battles in Egypt, and he's elected the governor of Egypt. While he's in charge, he just kind of like decides when he wants to listen to the Ottoman Empire. Like the Ottoman Empire declares war on somebody. Sometimes he'll send men, sometimes he won't. It's just kind of like, would it benefit him and would he profit from it? But what he does in Egypt is he westernizes their military while the Ottoman Empire as a whole really doesn't. He looks to Europe and he's like, what are they doing? What are the Prussians doing? What are the French doing? What are the British doing? And he kind of mimics pieces of their stuff. So whether it's the draft for selective service or whether it's European military training and structure, he's mimicking that, which sets him up for success because now they can compete with the Europeans. They also push for massive industrialization because in Egypt, they have the ability to export cotton. And when they're exporting cotton, they know that this is going to go to factories and it's going to go to textile mills. So they kind of get in on the ground floor at that. And you see this big push in Egypt while the Ottoman Empire doesn't do this stuff. They even go on so far as to get cocky enough to go and invade the Ottoman Empire, but they stop because the British, they have claims elsewhere and this would just mess up everything. But I mean, these guys are progressing at a more rapid rate than the Ottoman Empire ever will. So the things that are different is they didn't have any like peasant rebellions like China was experiencing. They don't have the large population growth that China has seen too. So their situations are a little different, but either way, they're both focusing on defensive modernization. Get our armies and things in order so we can defend ourselves if other, specifically Western powers, would attack us. So they try to do some early reforms that gain some success. Early reforms are leading to military revolts because we're changing the way that things work. But the most famous are the Tanzimat reforms. And the military is going to be more Western. They're going to get rid of the Janissaries that have always been this like iconic group of elite fighters with a lot of, rights and privileges. They start reading and thinking about the Enlightenment ideals of the time and reading those iconic thinkers we already talked about. They westernize legal codes. They undermine religious authority because remember, in this region, religion and secular life are really blurred. They're like, that can't be anymore. Other places are stepping away from church mixing with state, so we need to do that too. And this slide says no industrialization. I don't really like the term no industrialization. I would say like slow industrialization. They don't not do anything. They eventually start rolling out things like telegram lines and systems, railroads, steamships. Not very many factories, but they do it on a very small scale. But unfortunately, if you're going to westernize and industrialize, you need to go all out. You need to go big or go home. And they don't. The problem is you have a lot of people that don't really like what's going on or how it's being carried out. So the group that kind of makes the biggest stink about it all is going to be the Young Turks. The Young Turks are a group of younger people, as the name would suggest, and things are happening that are changing. I guess they're changing in the Ottoman Empire. So they have a constitution, they elect a parliament, and it exists for a bit. And people are pretty happy with the reforms with that Tanzimat stuff. But then the Russians threaten war, or there is a threat of war on the Ottomans. So whoever the emperor is, he's like, okay, these ways don't work. I need to take full charge. I need to protect us. And all of a sudden he goes back on everything that's been created and he goes back to traditional ways, which they've just been working on reforming. And he sits in that position for like 30 years. And people like the Young Turks, this growing group, is like, no, this is not how it works. We need to go back. We need to modernize. We need to industrialize. We need to go back before we had this new leader, this sultan, take over and become just like an absolute monarch again. So things that they favor, the one highlighted here is favored European democratic constitutional regime. They did not want a sultan. They did not want an absolute monarch or ruler or something like that. And so their big push is going to be to embrace Western society in some regards. And the fact that you can still be Islam, you can still practice their religion with accepting modernity. You could modernize and not get rid of traditional religions. Those things are not like, they're not one or the other. You can have both. So with this, in 1908, the Young Turks take over, and that's when they get real power. They are seen as a more radical branch, but they do things like encourage a Turkish language as the official language. They change schools and law codes. One of the most notable ones that like textbooks really focus on is the idea that they opened modern schools for women to receive an education, and women established a number of publications and organizations, some linked to British suffrage groups or voting rights groups. And then some women abandoned having that veil that covers them because there was an option for it now. Not all did. There were a lot of people who stuck to that, just kind of like a traditional way. But there were more options now, and people felt this was more enlightened or whatever you want to call it. So here we have the short-lived constitutional era where a woman is like the country or the state is symbolized by this young woman, and she's unveiled, and they're breaking chains on the other side. Like it all looks very enlightened and uplifting. And they even have an angel or some kind of thing flying overhead with the liberty, equality, and fraternity, which is the motto of the French Revolution. So the problem is, not everyone agrees what's going on, and we're going to talk on probably Friday about nationalism, and it just starts ripping apart the Ottoman Empire. All these different ethnicities exist under one roof or under one state, and they just aren't going to get along, and they don't really unite over this factor. Nationalism becomes a really rough ideal that drives the world into World War One. So I'm going to pause because I don't think I can get through Russia in 4 minutes. So that was it for the Ottomans.